Well, next week, President Biden will welcome Kenyan President William Ruto for a state visit at the White House. It'll be the third state visit ever for a leader of Kenya. And joining me to preview the meeting is Mvemba Phezo Dizolele. He's a director and senior fellow of the Africa program for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mvemba, thank you for joining me here on the DC Debrief. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you, John, for having me.
It's a wonderful thing to talk to you. And I do understand that the president was supposed to travel to Africa at some point here during his first term. And so I wonder if this visit from President Ruto is kind of a make good for that by President Biden. Do you see it as that way?
It certainly has that value, but Africa is a big continent. Africa is a continent of 54 countries. So hosting one president for a state visit is definitely a big deal because not every president in any country gets a state visit. President come to the White House all the time, but not everybody gets a state visit. So in that sense, it's a big deal. However, it does not make up for a failure to keep a promise. The promise, which was very high profile on the margin and leading up to the U.S. Africa Leadership Summit last year, or the year before, should have been honored. It's a tradition that has picked a lot of steam in the U.S., where U.S. president go to Africa. This go back to the days of Jimmy Carter, where they travel, and it's mostly symbolic, but that symbolism is very important because when you consider the U.S. is I'll use the word obsessed with great power competition. The US competitors show up in Africa regularly. So it is important that the Americans also show up if they really care about great power competition as they claim they do.
I think that's a big issue that I want to get into in just a second, what the competitors, what the U.S.'s chief adversaries have been doing on the continent over the last few years. But speaking first specifically about the relationship between Kenya and the United States, how important of an ally strategically is Kenya for the United States in Africa?
Kenya is a very important partner for the United States, whether it's on the trade front, whether on the security front, and now on political front. Kenya, as you know, sits right on the coast on the Indian Ocean. They have big port like Mombasa. The US maintained a military installation there at Manda Bay. They've been allies of the US at various levels, so there is no circumventing Kenya that way. But also, most importantly, Kenya is a stable country. It's a democracy. Like any other country, it goes with its own challenges, but nobody will argue that Kenya is not a democracy. They've since turned that page and they're moving forward. And also, Kenya has a strategic, unique partnership with the United States for trade and other engagement.
I also understand that Kenya is potentially seen as an inroads to helping improve relations between the United States and other countries inside the East African Community bloc. How could Kenya help improve relations between the U.S. and some of the other countries within that bloc?
Two things. Kenya is an economic power. As far as the region goes, it's an economic force. Strong financial institutions like Equity Bank and others, they've been projecting that power through the years. You go to Rwanda, you go to Tanzania, you go to Uganda, you come across Kenyan banks. Kenya, when it was the chairman of the East Africa Community, which is the regional economic community in that space, was able to single-handedly bring the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, into the EAC. Excuse me, that doubled literally the size of that community. Now that stretches from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Atlantic coast. So, and Kenya is really the primary beneficiary of that expansion because they have the economic and financial wherewithal. But the other thing is, Kenya has been really asserting itself in terms of leadership on the global stage. The previous president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, weighed in Tigray in Ethiopia, who are trying to help open a humanitarian corridor. He is the president who helped bring the DRC, Congo, into EAC. Recently, Kenya deployed troops as part of the regional intervention force in Eastern DRC. It was not a successful mission, but nevertheless, they tried. And now Kenya is poised to send a police force to Haiti to help stem that. They also, before that, just last year, where they hosted the first Africa Climate Summit. So there are a lot of if you will, notches on Kenya's record that show that they really committed to engaging and emerging as a regional power, to be an interlocutor, a serious interlocutor with external partners.
I've also read Kenya is a predominantly Christian nation. About 85% of the population identifies as Christian. Do you see that as a link to the United States, a shared similar values in terms of obviously the United States is a melting pot, and Kenya obviously has a significant portion of their population that is not Christian. But generally speaking, there seems to be a connection there between the United States and Kenya in terms of the faith of the people who live in those countries. Do you see that as a connection?
It's a connection. I'm not sure if it's the most important connection, in the sense that Kenya is a former colony of the Brit. It's a country that is fully espoused Western ways, quote unquote, post-colonial. The current president is an evangelical, though. Is a self-proclaimed Christian and is unabashful about it, right? So on a personal level, that may have some implication. I cannot really speak to that, but I'll just say Kenya, by virtue of its colonial experience, the past, is westbound, right? That does not mean that Kenya is not close to the Chinese. It doesn't mean Kenya is not close to the Russians. In fact, the president of Kenya visited Russia, right? Not that long ago. And he got a state visit there as well. I mean, sorry, I meant China.
Sure.
So it does not really reflect fully that way. I think it's more of the past. They have a commitment to the US and the West and the democratic values and so on. And that has been the mainstay of their engagement with the West.
You mentioned at the start of our interview that the United States is perhaps falling behind in terms of engagement in Africa, specifically with regards to what Russia and what China are doing there. I was reading, I think, somewhere that at the moment, in terms of the population, China is seen more favorably than the United States at this moment. And a lot of that is because of the inroads that China has made in investing in a lot of African countries. Can you speak to that a little bit? How has Russia, how has China been stepping up their influence in Kenya specifically, but also across the broader continent?
John, we are in what we call in the US great power competition. When you talk about great power competition in Washington, what you're talking about, the red versus the blue and all. In Africa, that's not how it plays out. In Africa, it's about options and opportunities. So African countries and the leaders say, we need a road, we need a port, we need schools. Do you want to finance this? Do you want to partner with us on this? If you can, if you want to, great. If you don't, you lose. And the US is often very reluctant to partner in that way. China, they build roads, they build hospitals, they build a lot of things. The Russians, when it comes to security, they have a lot of security and defense partnerships with African countries. You pretty much name it, they probably have that agreement. So the challenge for the United States is, on one level, the US insists a lot on values. We have values. You need to do this. Unless you do that, we're not going to engage with you. Well, if you are a president of a country X, you need a road. It's not about value, it's about a road, because farmers can then evacuate the produce to the market.
Yeah.
Value is value. There's no problem with value, but value does not put food on the table. Value does not help the farmer sell his a crop. This is part of the challenge that we have with the United States in Africa. Or if a country is at war, they need weapon system, they need to fight whatever enemy they're fighting, and the US is saying, unless you do this X, Y, it doesn't work. So it put the US in many ways at a disadvantage.
So China and Russia and other countries are giving citizens, giving governments what they need in order to have basic needs met, infrastructure, that sort of thing, more readily than perhaps America is willing to do without preconditions.
Absolutely. And this doesn't mean the partnership with China or Russia is not, it doesn't have its own problem. It does. But if your house is on fire, what you need is firemen, right? You don't need, that's not what your neighbor is trying to ask to offer you bread is a good idea. But first of all, let's put out this fire. And that's part of that challenge that we face with US-Africa relations, because and we in the United States also try to even elevate our culture wars, try to transfer them to everybody else. You know, American culture wars are American culture wars. Those issues do not always resonate the same way. Every country has its own culture wars, and they're not the same. So it can quickly turn into an adversarial relations. In fact, when people really want a friendly relation with the United States, it is the United States after all. It has means, it has values. People look up to some of the ideals that we all espouse in the US. We don't always translate that in a way that benefit our partners on the continent.
That's an excellent point. The culture wars are unique in each different country, and one country's culture wars aren't as impactful in another country. That's I think we forget that sometimes. That's an important thing to remember. This is also an important trip for President Ruto, is it not? What kind of support does he have at home?
He was elected, so that means he won the election. We cannot take that away from him. He presented himself as the hustler in chief, entrepreneurial, and so on. The challenge, like the rest of the world, the economy is key. You need to deliver on the economy. He promised a lot. He promised to fight the debt. But he did add to the Kenyan debt when he went to China, right? He went to China and he got actually more loans from China, which adds more. Job creation is one that he promised. To his credit, he's been in office only, 2 years or so now, going on 2 years. So we'll see what happens. Support, like any politician, it's always split, right? No politician ever gets 400% support.
Right.
So he's been very poised on projecting Kenyan power on the world stage. Travels a lot and so on. And that is, sometimes the people wonder, what are you bringing home? So coming here is definitely a big nod for him as an African leader, as a Kenyan leader. Not everybody gets a state visit, but that also raise the level of pressure that you'll be facing at home, because people will be waiting and asking, did you bring the bacon home? Where is it?
Yeah. Yeah. So my last question for you then is, it kind of piggybacks off of what you just said. What needs to happen in order for this to be considered a successful visit for both sides?
That remains to be seen. It's a state visit. It's very symbolic. It carries a lot of weight that way. We will see what comes out of it. It may be some good things. It may be not a lot of things. We all may be surprised. So it's early to say, because unless bilateral or kind of agreement gets signed, we really don't know. Personally, I'll say I'll wait and see.
Okay. Well, we will continue to follow this. And for those of you who would like more information about the Center for Strategic and International Studies Africa program, you can go over to their website and check out the different writings and the different posts that they have there. Mvemba Phezo Dizolele, thank you so much for joining me here on the DC Debrief. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John.